19th of March 2018, I'd like to start by acknowledging our forebears. We would like to acknowledge this meeting is being held on Aboriginal land of the Noongar Nation, and we pay respects to their elders, past and present. I'd like to introduce John McLennan, who's going to be speaking about Tinnies, and I won't say anything more because I'll let him do all of that.
Corrugated iron canoes, or tinnies, which is what I used to know them as when I was growing up. There's always someone with a tinny. At one stage my brother had one, or he had shares in one. But where did they come from? What happened to them? Why don't we see them anymore? Kenneth Graham of Toad of Toad Hall recorded Water Rat as saying, "Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats." We, the people of the Swan River, have made use of our waterways and have spent much of our time in messing about in boats. In the early days it was for transport and for commerce. By the turn of the 20th century, and the limiting of working hours, there was some free time available. Of course, that had to be filled, and how better to fill it in Perth than beside, in or on the Swan River. There are scattered newspaper reports of the important men of Perth racing their yachts on Perth water in the 1880s. Yacht and rowing clubs became notable society organisations during the pre-war, before 1913, 1914. Edwardian years were filled with balls and many mentions in the society pages of the local press. Yet there was one part of all this activity which rarely rated a mention. The urge to float on the river was not confined to the adults of a certain class. Young boys, reprehensibly adventurous, graduated from logs and bark dugouts made in imitation of the indigenous children, to throwing away sheets of used corrugated iron. Corrugated galvanised iron was invented in the 1820s in Britain. It arrived in WA in the early 1850s. By the 1890s, some of that corrugated iron was being replaced, and there was scrap available for reuse. Hang on, where have we gone? There. By a machine, I found that machine at New Norcia, and that one dates to the 1940s, but something similar was in use since at least 1904, because one little boy got his hand caught in it, or caught in one, and lost a finger. So there was an increasing stock of old corrugated iron. It's not documented just when or where the first tinny was made in WA, but there was at least one in 1893, because a chap by the name of Izzy Cohen of Northern in 1973 was the official starter of the first Avon descent. He was given this honour because in 1893, aged 13, he'd travelled down the Avon from Northern to Perth in a, quote, homemade galvanised iron canoe. The very first contemporary mention of a corrugated iron boat, contemporary, at the time, was in 1894, when one was used in the unsuccessful rescue of a drowning woman in Northern. Quote, it was quicker to get the boat than to go around the pool. Weak hearts was about 200 yards away. The boat was a corrugated iron one which a man could carry under his arm. Obviously a tinny. While it would seem there were many such vessels on the Swan, virtually no mention of them was made in the press. After all, who takes notice of what young boys do in their spare time? Did that click over? I don't think it did. There. There was a new entertainment in 1905, a water chute down from Kings Park into the Swan River. And young boys in their leaky punts were attracted to the spectacle. Right, quite a small flotilla of boats rowed backwards and forwards and sometimes across the course. Oh, sorry, this is just a page there. The upper reaches of the Swan at Guildford, a swimming carnival. And I think you can read that there. Two small boys added an air of animation to the scene by dexterously manipulating two small homemade canoes, mostly made up of a wooden framework and sheets of corrugated galvanised iron, flattened out. This particular course for a swimming carnival had some swimmers from New South Wales and Victoria. The star of the day was one Mr. F. Beaurepaire, who of course was an Olympic swimmer and then founded a tyre business. But he won the 500-yard scratch race in a time of 6 minutes and 34 seconds. There's no way of knowing how many of these canoes were in use on the Swan, Canning and Avon rivers. The reports from 1904 and 1908 showed no surprise at their presence. Indeed, there seems to be an air of acceptance. Then in the Northern Advertiser of April 1912, reported there was an accident on the Avon at Northern where a canoeing non-swimmer almost drowned. And that is key, a non-swimmer almost drowned. This is the next mention of galvanised iron canoes in the West Australian press. 1904, 1908 and 1912. So it's very sparse, but there's obviously a lot of the canoes around. So that was the first reported accident. Probably not the first accident, but the first reported accident. Still no apparent worry about the safety of the young boys involved in these accidents. Indeed, from way up north in Carnarvon, there was a report of a fleet of canoes in August of the same year, August 1912. They've got their whole fleet being built by all the kids. And so the Great War came and went, many young men died, some became heroes, and the press did not find anything newsworthy in what was happening with our young boys and their river activities. Then, in 1920, the Sunday Times, or at least one journalist employed by that paper, began a campaign which lasted for more than a decade in his column called They Say. They say that it's up to a lot of parents to avoid a drowning and an inquest on their boys. They say that it's the same old dangerous galvanised iron canoes are again in commission on the river. And then the last one, that a big hole belted in these dreadful scows and deep water will save weedy death and salt tears. Over the years his language became stronger. This dangerous galvanised iron dugout will not even float if overturned. That was in 21. In 22 he outdid himself. They say this is the season for idiotic amateur boat builders, that some of the crazy catamarans being launched will give the water police a job, that many galvanised iron canoes are being pinned together for suicide purposes, that a piece of ragged metal catching on a garment will drown the strongest swimmer. Then, in an entirely fictitious morality tale in 1924, they say that last week 2 lots of mere toddlers carted their galvanised iron canoes to that fatal fluid. That these horrible contractions have been made by the fathers of these prospective cadavers. That a strict penalty bylaw against them is the only way of saving the kiddies from corpsing. Oh. And we complain about journalism today. Late in the same year, he wrote that hundreds of these deadly dugouts are ready or in use along the Swan banks, that every adult who sees one of these amphibious coffins should hold it and sink it. The press itself reported that many of the boys who made these canoes were very poor. It's the only pleasure they get, for their parents are too poor to take them on steamers and ferries. This makes it likely their families had a high level of either functional literacy or functional non-literacy, and so newspaper warnings were often never seen by those at whom they were aimed. The final Sunday Times diatribe was in 1931, when 2 non-swimmers were saved from a sinking canoe in Lake Munga. They were saved. And they were again non-swimmers. Unexpectedly, a much longer fictional morality article appeared in the Sunday Times in 1937. And this was a made-up story just to make the point that canoes were dangerous. He really went overboard with it. 1926 saw the canoe mentioned in Parliament as a move was made to ban them, or at least ensure the juvenile paddlers could swim and knew how to navigate. I'm not quite sure how knowing how to navigate would help travelling in a tin canoe. In 1936, the Chief Inspector of Police, Mr. Purdue, was reported as saying, "Not the smallest task which the police department is set during the summer is that which involves investigation of reports that children had been drowned as a result of expeditions in homemade canoes." Was this an indication that the press was not doing its job of reporting fatalities, or was it simply a precautionary announcement to warn parents of a perceived danger? So we move on to the actual deaths, because there were fatalities in these canoes. And if we look at them, non-swimmer, a weak swimmer, a non-swimmer, could swim only very little. And then there's a canoe with floats up in Walloona, where a young 9-year-old died. And then again, a non-swimmer in East Perth in 1934. After, or with so few fatalities happening in WA, fatalities in New South Wales were being reported in the local press. And you'd had to look and read the article to note that it was in New South Wales, because if you just looked at the headline, swimmer, canoe, drowned. Automatic reaction, yes, it's a local guy. No, sorry, someone over in New South Wales. There are a number of reported rescues, but nothing informative can be gained from looking at these reports. There would have been many, many more unreported incidents. But the deaths themselves, yeah, they'd be reported, but that's all. If the kid was saved, 9 times out of 10, nobody noticed, because the kids saved themselves. And most of them, the vast majority, could swim. There was one incident which was of interest, and a young chap by the name of John Gaunt paddled a canoe out and saved a young kid who'd gone. This wasn't a child who was in a canoe, this was a child who was doing something in the river and disappeared. So John Gaunt got on his canoe, travelled out, dragged him back. With an adult, they were able to give him CPR or whatever it was, in artificial respiration in those days, in the boat. John Gaunt, of course, was Terry's brother. Sometimes those sinkings were deliberate, as it is recorded in an email received from a Geoffrey Jolly. We built them the same: bend over the ends, tar up the ends and holes, nail wood as a spreader to keep the iron open, then launch in the Swan up in the Swan Valley. These were built to sink, as you had to go down with the ship, hit the bottom and surface with a handful of mud or sand to prove you went to the bottom. Then throw it at your mates, dive down and retrieve the canoe with help of your mates, and then another had to do it. We did this till we needed a rest and then had sneaky fag on the banks. So, yeah, they were fun. You could sink them, you could raise them up, and the kids did it as sport. While the beginnings of Tinnies may be seen in the 1890s, they spread around the state very quickly. This is distribution now, at a time without radio, television or the internet. By 1905 they were present on the Swan River below Kings Park and thought quite unremarkable. The canoes were reported on the South Perth shore of the Canning River in 1912. Already mentioned was a fleet of around 20 canoes in Carnarvon in 1912. There was also an organised race for tin canoes in Bunbury of the same year. This is all pre-First World War. In 1914, a group of Boy Scouts helped search for a drowned woman off the South Perth shore using their tinny canoes. During the floods of 1926, which we know about for what it did to the aerodrome, at least one boy took advantage of the flooded streets of Fremantle to exercise his paddling skills. In 1927, there was a couple of mishaps at Cottesloe Beach. One paddler was blown 4 miles out to sea, but got back, and others capsized in the surf. The tin canoe was being used in much more adventurous ways in the open ocean. The Catholic orphanage Clontarf on the banks of the Canning River had a fleet of homemade canoes in 1930. Later that year, Clontarf again figured photographically. And that's just one organisation with around about 24 tinnies. So you can imagine how many are spread right along the banks of the rivers. In 1931, that's the obligatory feel-good image for Christmas in 1931. There was a move in 1931 to eradicate water hyacinths from Lake Munga, and it was seriously discussed that boys in tin canoes could do the job. In 1932 it was reported there were 50 tin canoes on the river at that year's Swim Through Bayswater. Hannon's Lake in the Goldfields, a seasonal body of water, was reported as having homemade canoes on its surface when in flood. And in 1934, the sad event at Lake Violet, Wiluna, that was the 9-year-old boy who drowned, revealed that canoes had reached that far, as far as Wiluna. The Sunday Times reported that there were over 100 of these suicide craft in the South Perth Como foreshore. In 1936, the Sunday Times broke its editorial rules and showed how much fun these craft were. 1939 was the year 4 big kids travelled down the Avon to the Swan River in galvanised iron canoes, a possible forerunner for the now famous Avon descent. The humble toy canoe had travelled widely in Western Australia. Elsie Woodsley sent me an email. In the early 40s, my father was the local baker in Balingup. When the local lads had their canoes sink to the bottom of the local swimming pool, called the Rocks, in the Balingup Brook, they would call on my father, Baker Bill, to dive down with a rope to tie onto the canoe so it could be pulled to the surface. as I remember, lots of cheering. Sometimes he would have to do this several times in an afternoon, depending on how many had sunk that week. I know they had to wait till the weekend for my father to be able to help them. These canoes were made for one sheet of corrugated iron with a piece of timber at each end and lots of tar. Ron Glasson emailed me. We had a corrugated iron canoe at Mandurah. One end had a piece of wood nailed to it as a stern, and the bow was just folded together with a piece of wood on each side bolted together. It had nail holes in the sheet because it was recycled, and we waterproofed it and the ends with excess tar we chopped off the edge of the road. We used to hide it in the rushes and pole it about the estuary. A lot of fun for us kids in simpler times. Another source of waterproofing was the gum from 7-year wattles, mixed with ash, but it was terribly sticky, worse than the tar and harder to get off your hands. Tar was okay as long as, the tin was in water, but if it got hot in the sun, then it would run out the joints. Acacia gum was harder and not prone to melt in the sun, but less flexible. The best of both worlds. Dads interfering with kids. I think that's it. Yes. The history of being a father in Western Australia during the 19th and 20th centuries splits neatly into 3 sections: pre-Great War, between the wars, and after World War II. These 3 styles of parenting, both social and private, can be seen in the attitudes to the tinny. Taking into account the social stratification of the day, the pre-Great War attitude was one of laissez-faire. While there may have been some parental admonitions to take care, the upper echelons of society looked on the activities of the feral lower-class children with amused tolerance. After the Great War, attitudes changed. There were several possible reasons for that. Returned servicemen were often traumatised, and this extended through all levels of society. Parents, both of the children and of society, parents in society being the police, the churchmen, the teachers, politicians, the important people, they felt a greater responsibility for the life of the young. Those in positions of authority wrote of the dangers of tinnies and even took action, as in Parliament. As in there, which is difficult to read, but basically they were proposing that to float on the river you had to be able to navigate, you had to know the rules of the road, as it were, and a whole lot of other stuff. And you had to be able to swim. How they intended to enforce it, I have no idea. Then in 1934, the Civic Fathers tried the same thing, to prevent canoeing. However, the town clerk informed the meeting that they did not have that power. So there. As war clouds again appeared in Europe, there was a move from the societal parents to regulate, or was it to regiment, the children at this time. Moves were made to improve the design of tinnies to make them safer. The Sea Scouts were seen as the ultimate authority. The only problems with these design improvements was that they cost money at a time when money was in very short supply, certainly amongst the working men's families and especially amongst their children. Following World War II, fathers who had been brought up by traumatised men from the Great War took a closer interest in what their own children were doing. Yet they were feeling their way into a new style of parenting. Taught by the discipline of their own regiments, they were still harsh, but tried to take an interest in what the new generation was doing. Schooling was closely supervised, sporting activities were opening up, and there were fewer of the wild children living a largely unsupervised life. In the bush, canoeing became a family event, as can be seen from this little article from a young lady in Dumbleyoung. And she went and paddled in her brother's boat and found it would carry her, to her great surprise. So girls were starting to get involved as well, but this is post-World War II. Family became important at all levels of society, and in a post-war boom there was money to spare. Boys, including the author, myself, had Meccano and model trains to take up their time. Sporting clubs were opening up, and there were scouting and Christian Endeavour groups. Tinnies were exchanged for the now affordable small yachts, and many children went fishing and boating with fathers and family. Again, from the author's memory, my memory, an uncle from a lower working class background, which was my background, just a few years older than myself, bought and raced a Flying Dutchman yacht in the mid-1950s. So there was disposable income to be spent in poor neighbourhoods, and the pull of the river was still strong. From memory, that uncle had started off with a tinny before he bought the yacht. While they continued into the 1950s and 60s, there were fewer and fewer tinnies. Gail Mandura, that's her email name, wrote an email to me about her time in the 1950s. Growing up, we lived on a street which led to a weir on the Canning River. That's on Kent Street, for those who don't know that side of the river. The weir divided the fresh water from the salt water, and it was a favourite swimming hole. I saw many, many homemade corrugated iron canoes passing by, carried, towed behind the bike, or pulled on a homemade wagon sporting pram wheels. My future husband was one of the kids who regularly passed with one. Television took over a lot of spare time, and there was a coincidental decline in the raw material for tinnies as Perth roofs were being tiled and second-hand corrugated galvanised iron began to disappear. From the author's memory, by 1970 there were very few of this craft left on the Swan, Canning and Avon rivers. After providing close on a century of do-it-yourself fun, this homemade toy sank to the bottom, not with great fanfare, but with a quiet, barely noticed gurgle. Thank you. So,
any questions of John? Anybody like to ask a question, or maybe reminiscences about when you had a tinny and you used to... Yeah, there were all hands up everywhere. Pam, you surprised me. I didn't think you had a tinny.
I have a gorgeous picture which I had hoped to bring tonight, but it's my husband in about 1935 sitting on the creek in their farm in Bridgetown in a beautiful tinny canoe, and he used to go out and get the tar off the road.
Right. Yes.
It's a gorgeous photo, but his nephew's borrowed it to photograph of the family archives or something.
That'd be great.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
He didn't drown.
Very few of us did.
Yeah, we used to make them in the late 50s, and I don't know if you know where the DeLacy
Yes.
Oval is. That used to flood every year. It was about 2 metres deep. I think it was could have been the stormwater drain collection, but it used to flood every year. And that's where we used to have our canoes. We weren't allowed to take them to the river.
Right.
And sail along this lake. And if they got too bad, there were holes in them, we just let them sink. And then in the summertime when the lake drained, we dried up and saw these tinnies. Tinny graveyard. We used to get our tin from the rubbish tip.
Yes.
Where Barton Park is now is a rubbish tip.
Yes.
Loads of tin there.
They weren't blowing them up, were they?
Right.
None.
They used no sparklers for doing that. You didn't get into that.
I know Keith told me he spent some time on the lake in Bedford Park in a tinny. Yes.
We used to bury it, like put it in the water.
Right.
And you come back a couple of days later and pull it up and empty it out.
Yes.
It's a technical issue. I was a canoe builder at the Coon Street, South Perth.
Oh, yes.
So we've got our ready material for a big rubbish chip was there.
Yes.
But you need to get a day when the temperature was 103 in the old money. And then you hit the street with jam tin at night, and you get half of the tin full, and you build 3 canoes out of it.
Ah,
You
right.
have to get the temperature.
Yes.
It's like around 41 or something.
Yep.
Yeah. And so you take all the bitumen. So pray for the weather.
So you were the reason there were so many potholes in those days.
John, do you know, is there anywhere around Perth where these tinnies still exist? Can we see any of them in the museum?
The only one I know of is in the Fremantle Maritime Museum as part of the Tin Canoes to the America's Cup exhibition. That's the only one I know of.
I've certainly been there a few times and never know, so...
Right. Yes.
Well, look, again, thanks, John, and I wanted to give you a presentation. You know the usual thing, this is a red or a white or a chocolate.
Just a white, if I may.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you. I must say, in closing, thank you very much, Marie-Louise, for your help in preparing this whole talk and for presenting it for me in Sydney at the Association of Sports Historians, Australian Association of Sports Historians, back in July last year. Thank you, Marie-Louise.